15 years ago, my daughter left a stained backpack and 3 toddlers on my front porch with a passing promise that she would be back in a few days. She vanished like a ghost. I raised those kids on grease sweat and a mechanic's meager wages. But yesterday the ghost finally came back. She did not come with an apology. She did not come with open arms. She came with a ruthless city lawyer, a stack of legal threats, and a demand to take every single thing I have left in this world. Before I tell you how this nightmare unfolded, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from today. You are going to want to stick around for this one, because by the time we got to the courtroom, the truth I uncovered made even the judge pale in disbelief. My name is Rick. I am 77 years old, and I run a dusty, struggling auto repair shop on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. I have spent my entire life under the chassis of broken-down trucks, breathing in exhaust fumes and wiping black sludge from my knuckles. It is not a glamorous life, but it is an honest one. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The air in the shop was thick with the smell of old oil and damp rust. I was lying flat on a creeper dolly, wedged underneath a beat-up Ford F-150, trying to coax a seized transmission bolt loose. My shoulders ached. My joints popped with every turn of the wrench. At my age, the cold concrete floor saps the heat right out of your bones. Suddenly, the harsh afternoon sunlight spilling into the garage bay was blocked out. A pair of shiny, expensive leather shoes stepped into my line of sight, stopping just inches from my boots. They did not belong to any customer I knew. People who wear $300 loafers do not bring their cars to my shop. I slid out from under the truck, wiping my filthy hands on a rag, squinting up at the stranger. He was a young guy wearing a sharp gray suit and a blank, indifferent expression. "Are you Richard Gallagher?" he asked. His voice was completely flat, the kind of voice that delivers bad news for a living. "That is me," I said, tossing the rag onto a nearby workbench. "What can I do for you?" He did not say another word. He just reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and dropped it right onto my chest. I caught it out of reflex, leaving a dark smudge of oil on the pristine white label. "You have been served, Mr. Gallagher," he said, turning on his heel and walking out of the garage before I could even take a breath. I stood there in the quiet shop, the hum of the air compressor, the only sound in the room. A strange, heavy dread began to pool in the pit of my stomach. I had always paid my bills. I did not owe money to the bank. I tore open the seal, my calloused fingers fumbling slightly, and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. The official seal of the family court glared back at me. I scanned the bold black letters at the top of the page. Plaintiff? Monica Gallagher. My heart stopped beating. The air was sucked out of my lungs. Monica. My daughter. The woman who had walked away from her own flesh and blood 15 years ago without a backward glance. I gripped the paper so hard my knuckles turned white, the edges of the document crinking under the pressure. I forced my eyes to keep reading. She was not just suing me. The words on the page felt like physical blows. Petition for immediate custody. Petition for asset reallocation and property control. Custody. The word echoed in my mind, sickening and absurd. I thought about the 3 lives I had molded with my own 2 hands. Tyler is 23 now, staying up late every night studying for his architectural engineering exams. Maya is 21, working grueling shifts in her blue scrubs for her nursing rotations. And Leo, my youngest, is 19, standing in the back of this very shop every weekend learning how to weld so he can take over the family business. Custody. She wanted custody of children who were practically adults. Children she had not sent a single birthday card to in a decade and a half. Children who had cried themselves to sleep asking where their mommy was until they simply stopped asking. And the property. She wanted the shop. The very ground I was standing on, the only asset I had left in my name, the inheritance I planned to leave the kids to ensure they never had to struggle the way I did. A hot, blinding anger washed over me. It was not the panicked fear of an old man. It was the fierce, protective rage of a father who was watching a predator circle his camp. I had sacrificed my retirement, my savings, and my twilight years to put food on the table for her kids. I ate canned soup for months so Tyler could have a new winter coat. I sold my prized vintage motorcycle to pay for Maya's braces. And now, out of nowhere, she wanted to sweep in and take the kingdom she had abandoned. I was so consumed by the roaring in my ears that I did not hear the side door of the shop squeak open. I did not hear the familiar heavy footsteps echoing against the concrete. "Hey, Grandpa," a voice called out. "I got those brake pads you ordered from the warehouse." I snapped my head up. It was Tyler. He was wearing his faded college hoodie, carrying a cardboard box of car parts, a bright, easy smile on his face. I tried to hide the documents. I tried to shove them behind my back, but my hands were shaking too much. The thick stack of papers slipped from my greasy fingers and scattered across the filthy floor, landing right at Tyler's feet. Tyler paused. He set the box down on a tire stack and knelt down to help me pick them up. "No, leave it," I barked, my voice cracking with a harshness I did not intend. But it was too late. His eyes caught the bold black font on the top page. I watched his face closely. I watched the easy smile melt away, replaced by a pale, absolute stillness. He read the name. Plaintiff Monica Gallagher. He slowly stood up, the paper trembling in his hand. He looked at me, his eyes wide, filled with a horrific mixture of betrayal and disbelief. Grandpa Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the garage. "I thought you said she was dead." The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever felt in my life. The ghost was not just on the porch anymore. She was inside our house, and the war had just begun. I did not speak to Tyler. I took the legal papers from his trembling hand, folded them, and shoved them into my greasy coveralls. I told him to wash up. Inside, my heart was hammering against my ribs. I walked into our small kitchen. It had been the center of our universe for 15 years. It was where I bottle-fed Leo at 3 in the morning. It was where I helped Maya with her science projects. It was where Tyler sat crying over his first broken heart. Now it felt like a waiting room for a funeral. I pulled a frozen lasagna from the freezer, shoved it into the oven, and sat at the head of the table. I waited. The front door rattled open. Maya walked in first. She wore blue hospital scrubs, her hair in a messy bun, dark circles under her eyes from a 12-hour nursing rotation. She dropped her heavy backpack with an exhausted sigh. Close behind her was Leo. He smelled like burnt metal, his hands covered in the same black grease that stained my own. Finally, Tyler stepped into the kitchen. He did not look at his brother or sister. He did not look at me. He just sat down, his eyes fixed on the wooden table. The lasagna finished baking. I placed it in the center. Normally, the kids would be fighting over corner pieces, teasing each other. Tonight, no one moved. The silence in the room was suffocating. It was incredibly heavy, thick, and toxic. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the crumpled legal documents, and dropped them right next to the baking dish. The heavy thud made Maya jump. "What is that?" Maya asked, her voice cautious. Her eyes darted from the papers to my face, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Tyler finally spoke, his voice completely hollow. "It is a lawsuit. From our mother." Leo stopped halfway to grabbing a glass of water. His hand froze in midair. He slowly turned his head toward Tyler. "What the hell are you talking about?" Leo demanded. "Grandpa told us she died in a car crash out west when I was 4. Tyler pointed a shaking finger at the papers. "Read it yourself. She is alive, and she is suing Grandpa for the property and for custody of us." Leo snatched the documents from the table. His eyes scanned the front page, and I watched the color drain from his face, only to be replaced by a dark, violent shade of red. He threw the papers back onto the table so hard they scattered across the food. Are you kidding me? Leo shouted, his chair scraping violently against the linoleum as he stood up. Custody. I am 19 years old. I am a grown man. Where was she when I broke my arm in the 5th grade? Where was she when we could not afford the heating bill and had to sleep in our coats? I will kill her. If she steps foot on this driveway, I swear to God, I will take a wrench to her skull. Leo, sit down. I ordered, my voice sharp and commanding. I did not raise you to be a thug. Sit down. Leo sank back into his chair, breathing heavily, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. But Maya was not angry. Maya was staring at the papers with a look that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. Her eyes were welling up with tears. She reached out and touched the signature on the bottom page almost as if she were touching a ghost. Grandpa, she whispered, her voice trembling. Is it really her? Is she really alive? I nodded slowly. Yes, sweetheart. She is alive. Maya looked up at me, tears spilling over her eyelashes and running down her pale cheeks. Why did you tell us she was dead? Why did you lie to us all these years? The accusation in her voice felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I lied because the truth was too cruel for a 6-year-old to understand, I said, leaning forward. I lied because telling you that your mother chose drugs, money, and random men over you would have destroyed your soul. I gave you a tragedy you could mourn instead of a rejection you would carry forever. Tyler suddenly pushed his chair back and stood up. I am going to my room, he muttered, turning his back on us. Tyler, wait, Maya pleaded. We need to talk about this. There is nothing to talk about, Tyler snapped, not looking back. She is a stranger. I do not care what she wants. His bedroom door slammed shut down the hall. I sat there looking at my 2 remaining grandchildren. Leo was shaking with rage. Maya was crying softly, clearly harboring a desperate secret hope that her mother had finally come back to love her. I realized right then that Monica did not even need to win the lawsuit to destroy us. The piece of paper on the table was already doing it. She was tearing my family apart without even stepping into the room. Then the sharp, sudden sound of a phone vibrating pierced the heavy silence. It was coming from Maya's scrub pocket. She sniffled, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve, and pulled out her phone. The screen lit up the dim kitchen. I watched her face. I watched her tear-filled eyes widen in shock. Her breath hitched in her throat. Who is it? Leo asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. Maya did not answer him. She just stared at the glowing screen, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Maya, I said gently. Who sent you a message? She slowly looked up from the phone, her eyes locking onto mine. It is an unknown number, she whispered. But the message says Grandpa is lying to you. I never wanted to leave. Let me explain. Mom. I stared at the bright glowing screen of Maya's cell phone, the cruel words burning deeply into my tired mind. I never wanted to leave. Let me explain. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of that text message made my blood run completely cold. Before I could fully process the manipulation, the lawsuit dragged me into a suffocating, bureaucratic nightmare. It was truly deeply horrifying. Absolutely. 2 days later, I sat in a sterile, windowless conference room at the downtown courthouse for a mandatory mediation session. The air conditioning was turned up too high, making the fluorescent lights hum above us. Across the heavy oak table sat Bradley Peterson. He was the kind of slick city lawyer who wore tailored suits costing more than my transmission lifts. He had artificially white teeth, slicked back hair, and a practiced smile that never reached his calculating eyes. He sat meticulously organizing his aligned legal documents, projecting an aura of absolute arrogant control. I sat alone, unable to afford a lawyer, yet relying only on my worn work boots and calloused hands to ground me. Then the heavy wooden door creaked open, and she walked in. Monica. After 15 years of absolute silence, there she was. She looked older, but she deliberately styled herself to appear incredibly fragile. She wore a slightly faded beige cardigan, wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her hair pulled into a messy knot. She wore no makeup, making her skin look pale. The moment her eyes met mine, she gasped, covered her mouth with trembling hands, and burst into uncontrollable tears. It was a spectacular, heart-wrenching performance. She practically collapsed into the chair next to Bradley, sobbing quietly into her hands, refusing to look me in the eye. I sat there completely frozen, a storm of conflicted emotions raging inside my chest. Bradley leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. He began to weave a tale so tragic and perfectly constructed that for a second I felt the room spin. He claimed softly that my daughter never intentionally abandoned her children. According to his narrative, Monica had been secretly suffering from undiagnosed severe postpartum depression that spiraled into a complete psychological break. He told the mediator that she wandered away blindly into the storm that night, in a state of sheer delirium, desperately trying to find a medical clinic. Instead, she was picked up by authorities in another state, misidentified, and involuntarily committed to a grim psychiatric facility. He claimed she was locked away against her will, heavily medicated, and kept isolated for years without any access to a telephone or legal representation. When she miraculously finally recovered and secured her release, she immediately came looking for us. But Bradley claimed with a heavy sigh, I had moved away, changed my phone numbers, and deliberately hidden her precious children from her out of bitter, misplaced spite. He painted her as the ultimate tragic victim, a loving, devoted mother who had been cruelly robbed of her entire family by a controlling, vindictive father. Then Bradley dropped the sympathetic act and turned his cold, shark-like eyes directly on me. He did not even bother to raise his voice, but the venom in his tone was unmistakable and chilling. He explicitly told me that if I did not voluntarily surrender full custody of my grandchildren and immediately sign over the property deed to my repair shop to Monica, he would aggressively file severe elder abuse and child endangerment charges against me. He threatened to paint me in front of a judge as a dangerously senile, deeply abusive old man who had essentially kidnapped his own grandchildren and systematically brainwashed them against their mother. He casually promised to drag my reputation through the local mud, bankrupt my business, with endless litigation, and ensure I spent my final declining years living in absolute poverty or rotting inside a federal prison cell. Monica sobbed even louder at his words, burying her pale face deep into a white tissue, her shoulders shaking violently with grief. Sitting there under the harsh lights, I felt a sudden sickening wave of terrible doubt wash over my exhausted mind. For one brief, agonizing moment, I actually wondered if I had been entirely wrong all these years. Had I completely misunderstood the events of that terrible night? Had my only daughter truly been suffering alone in a locked, padded room while I cursed her name every single day? The heavy guilt started to creep deeply into my aching old chest, dark and suffocating. I had spent 15 years hating her, and now I was being told she was a victim of a broken medical system. I slowly lowered my tired, heavy head, staring blankly at the ugly carpeted floor, feeling completely overwhelmed by the crushing weight of her desperate tears and the lawyer's ruthless threats. That was the exact moment when I saw it. Underneath the heavy oak table, perfectly hidden from the mediator's sympathetic view, were Monica's feet. She was nervously tapping her heel against the metal table leg. She was wearing a pair of flawless, crystal-embellished, pointed-toe designer heels. I knew enough from watching Maya scroll through expensive fashion magazines during her high school years to instantly recognize the distinct, luxurious brand. They were authentic Jimmy Choo stilettos, custom-designed, easily worth over $2,000. A destitute, recovering psychological victim who had spent years locked away in a ward and was desperately trying to put her shattered life back together, did not walk into a courthouse wearing $2,000 luxury shoes. The suffocating guilt I felt just seconds ago evaporated in an absolute instant. It was immediately replaced by a cold, sharp, and terrifying clarity that cleared my clouded mind. My seasoned gut feeling roared back to life far louder and much angrier than ever before. This was definitely not a tragic family reunion. This was a highly calculated, incredibly dangerous financial heist, and I was now the absolute only thing left standing in her way. I did not say another word in that mediation room. I stood up, pushed my chair back, and walked out without looking back at Monica or her attorney. The wooden door shut behind me, sealing her fake tears inside. I stepped into the humid Pittsburgh afternoon. I did not drive back to my repair shop. I got into my truck and drove straight to the industrial side of the city, pulling up to a faded brick building wedged between a diner and a dry cleaner. The peeling gold lettering on the glass door read, "Thomas O'Connor, Attorney at Law." Tom and I went way back. We served in the same infantry division decades ago. Afterward, he went to law school and spent 30 years as a ruthless criminal defense attorney before slowing down to handle family law. His office was a mess of overflowing filing cabinets, stacks of legal briefs, and the permanent smell of stale coffee. He sat behind his heavy desk wearing a wrinkled shirt with the sleeves rolled up, peering at a computer screen through thick reading glasses. I walked in and dropped the manila envelope onto his desk. He did not flinch. He slowly took off his glasses, looked at the envelope, and then looked at my face. I told him everything. I explained the sudden lawsuit, the custody threats, the devastating text message Maya received, and the flawless designer shoes hidden beneath the table. Tom listened in absolute silence. He did not interrupt. He simply steepled his fingers, his sharp blue eyes studying my expressions. When I finished, Tom picked up the lawsuit. He flipped past the first few pages, skipping the emotional custody demands entirely. His eyes darted across the legal jargon until he stopped at the last page. He tapped his finger on the signature line. Bradley Peterson. Tom muttered, his voice gravelly and suspicious. You said this guy was sitting next to her today. I nodded. Tom leaned back in his creaky leather chair and let out a low whistle. Rick, you are missing the bigger picture here, Tom said, tossing the document back onto the desk. Bradley Peterson does not do pro bono family law. He does not care about reunited mothers or postpartum depression. Peterson is a senior partner at a massive corporate firm in Philadelphia. His hourly rate is more than what you make in a month repairing transmissions. He represents real estate developers and corporate acquisitions. A guy like him does not drive across the state to help a broke patient win a custody battle. He is here for something else. I frowned, confusion briefly replacing my anger. But what else is there, I asked. You know how I live, Tom. You have seen my bank account. I have the shop, the tools inside it, and a pile of medical bills from when my late wife was sick. There is absolutely nothing for a corporate shark to steal. Tom did not answer immediately. He turned toward his desk and woke up his computer. Let us see what we can find out, he mumbled, typing rapidly. He opened the county property database and the city council public records. I walked around the desk and stood behind him. Tom navigated through complex zoning maps of our district. He pulled up the deed to my property. The deed still had my late wife's name on it, which meant her biological daughter, Monica, theoretically had a legal claim to her half. Look at this, Tom said, pointing at a highlighted section on the map. The city council held a closed-door session 3 months ago. They just approved the new highway expansion project. Do you see where the proposed exit ramp is going to be built? I squinted at the blue lines intersecting the map. My stomach dropped. The major commercial exit ramp was slated to run directly through the abandoned industrial park right behind my property. Exactly, Tom said. Because of that highway expansion, the city quietly rezoned your entire block last month. It is no longer zoned for light industrial use. It has been officially rezoned for prime commercial development. Massive corporations are already buying up the surrounding lots through shell companies to build a shopping center. Your rusty auto shop is sitting right in the middle of the only access road they need to connect the highway to the new commercial hub. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. So she did not come back because she suddenly missed her children. I whispered, my voice thick with a mixture of profound disgust and fury. She came back because of the rezoning. Tom clicked his mouse, bringing up a commercial property valuation calculator. He typed in the square footage of my land, applied the new zoning multipliers, and hit enter. The number that flashed on the screen was so large it did not even look real. Rick, Tom said softly, taking his glasses off and looking me dead in the eye. You always told me you thought your property was worth maybe $200,000. That is what it was worth yesterday. But with the new commercial zoning and developers desperate for this exact access point, the valuation has skyrocketed. Your land is not worth $200,000. It is currently valued at $4.5 million. The air vanished from my lungs. $4.5 million. Monica had somehow caught wind of the upcoming real estate boom. She knew the property was still partly in her dead mother's name. She hired a corporate shark, fabricated a heartbreaking story of mental illness, and filed a lawsuit demanding full custody of her children just to gain complete legal control over my assets. She was absolutely never trying to be a truly loving mother, returning to her precious children after a very long absence. She was simply trying to steal a massive $4.5 million estate from her very own devastated, broken family. I sat in Tom's dusty office staring at the glowing computer screen until the numbers blurred together. $4.5 million. The sheer magnitude of that number should have made me dizzy. It should have made me panic. Instead, as the reality of Monica's ultimate betrayal sank into my bones, a strange, absolute calm washed over me. I did not yell. I did not slam my fists against the heavy wooden desk. When you spend your entire life taking apart broken, ruined engines, you learn a fundamental truth about machines and people. If you hit a seized bolt with a hammer in a blind rage, you will only strip the threads and destroy the entire block. But if you take a step back, study the mechanism, apply a little oil, and find the exact point of weakness, you can dismantle the whole thing with just a flick of your wrist. Monica thought she was dealing with a clueless, exhausted old man who would crumble under the weight of a fancy corporate lawsuit. She thought I was just a grease monkey who did not understand the grand game she was playing. I looked at Tom, who was watching me with deep concern etched into his wrinkled face. Do not file any counter motions yet, I told him, my voice completely steady. Do not let her lawyer know that we figured out the zoning change. Let them think they still have the upper hand. Tom frowned, leaning back in his creaky leather chair. Rick, what exactly are you planning to do? I stood up, adjusting my faded work jacket. I am going to do what I do best, I said quietly. I am going to set a trap. I left his office and drove slowly back to my repair shop. The late afternoon sun was casting long, dark shadows across the cracked concrete of my driveway. I looked at the rusted signs, the stacks of old tires, and the grease-stained bay doors. To the rest of the world, it was an eyesore. To me, it was the fortress where I had safely raised my 3 beautiful grandchildren. And I was absolutely not going to let a greedy, heartless stranger tear down its walls. I walked into my small, cramped back office and locked the door. I sat down heavily in my old desk chair. I needed Monica to let her guard down completely. I needed her to believe that her ruthless tactics had already won. I reached for the heavy black landline telephone on my desk. I dialed the number listed on the legal paperwork, the number for her expensive downtown hotel suite. As the phone began to ring, I closed my eyes and completely shifted my posture. I slumped my shoulders forward. I let my breathing become shallow and ragged. I channeled every single ache in my 77-year-old joints, every ounce of exhaustion from the past 15 years, and pushed it straight into my throat. Hello, a woman answered. Her voice was sharp, polished, and entirely unfamiliar. It was Monica. I let out a dry, rattling cough before I spoke. Monica, I rasped, making my voice tremble just enough to sound pathetic and defeated. It is your father. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, the fake crying victim from the mediation room was completely gone. Her tone was icy and terribly condescending. What do you want, Dad? I coughed again, gripping the edge of my desk. I am tired, Monica, I whispered, letting out a long, shaky sigh. I am so very tired. I cannot fight this huge corporate lawyer of yours. My heart cannot take the stress of a long trial. I do not have the money or the energy to go to court and drag our family name through the mud. I just want peace. Please. I heard a subtle shift in her breathing, a quiet, triumphant intake of air. You should have thought about that before you stole my children, she replied, trying to maintain her righteous anger. But I could hear the greedy anticipation bleeding through her words. I do not want to fight anymore, I pleaded, making my voice crack with manufactured sorrow. If I agree to sign over the deed to the property, if I give you your mother's land, will you please just drop the custody petition? Tyler and Maya are adults, but Leo still needs his grandfather. Please, Monica, just take the dirt and leave the kids out of this. The silence stretched on for several agonizing seconds. I could perfectly picture her sitting in her luxury hotel room, smiling a wicked, victorious smile. She thought she had broken me. She thought her brilliant manipulation had crushed the old man without ever needing to step foot inside a courtroom. Okay, Dad, she finally said, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. I am glad you are finally seeing reason. I will speak to Bradley. I will give you a few days to get your affairs in order and draft the surrender papers. But do not try any tricks. You do not have the power to win this. I will not cause any trouble, I whispered weakly. Thank you, Monica. She hung up the phone without another word. The dial tone hummed softly in the quiet, dim office. I slowly placed the heavy receiver back onto its plastic cradle. The exact moment the phone clicked into place, the frail, trembling old man completely vanished. I sat up perfectly straight. My breathing was calm, deep, and incredibly steady. My hands were no longer shaking. I grabbed my worn leather wallet from the desk drawer and walked straight out the door. I drove directly to the local bank branch just before they closed their heavy glass doors for the evening. I walked up to the teller and quietly withdrew my final $10,000 in retirement savings in crisp cash. With the envelope of $100 bills resting heavily in my jacket pocket, I drove to the grittiest part of the South Side. The address Tom wrote led me to a windowless office above a failing laundromat. The name on the frosted glass door read Thorne Investigations. I walked in and sat across from a man who looked like he had not slept in a decade. His name was Victor Thorne. He was not the kind of investigator who took cheap photos of cheating spouses. He was a ruthless, meticulous ghost who specialized in tearing apart corporate frauds and tracking down people who desperately wanted to stay hidden. I dropped the envelope onto his scratched desk. $10,000, I said, my voice steady. I need to know absolutely everything about Monica Gallagher, where she has been for the last 15 years, who she associates with, and what she is actually doing in my town. Victor did not even count the cash. He slid the envelope into his drawer and nodded. I will tear her life apart down to the studs, he promised in a raspy voice. You will have your answers very soon. I left his office feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. But that feeling evaporated the exact second I walked through my front door. Sitting squarely on the kitchen island was a bright white rectangular box. I recognized the silver logo immediately. It was a brand new top-of-the-line MacBook laptop easily worth $2,500. Maya was standing at the counter, gently running her hand over the smooth cardboard. She had a conflicted look on her face, a mixture of deep guilt and intoxicating excitement. Where did that come from? I asked, though my sinking stomach already knew the terrible answer. Maya flinched slightly. It arrived by courier a few minutes ago, she replied, her voice defensive and thin. There was a card inside. Mom sent it. She said she knows my nursing program requires a fast computer, and she just wanted to help me succeed. I stared at her, feeling a hot wave of disbelief rising in my chest. Maya, I said, struggling to keep my voice even. You cannot accept that. You know exactly what she is doing. She is trying to buy your loyalty with shiny plastic. I am not turning against you, Grandpa Maya shot back, crossing her arms defensively. But my laptop has been broken for 6 months. I stay up until 3 in the morning at the library to type my medical reports. I need this to pass my rotations. I took a step forward, exhaustion crashing on my shoulders. I would have bought you a new computer, I pleaded. We could have figured it out. We could have set up a payment plan. You did not need to take a bribe from a woman who abandoned you. You do not understand, Maya cried out, tears welling up in her eyes. You struggled to pay the heating bill, Grandpa. You gave up everything for us, and I hate watching you suffer. She is my mother. If she has the money and wants to finally act like a parent, why should I suffer just to protect your fierce pride? Her words felt like a physical blow. It was not about my pride. It was about her safety. I looked at the little girl I had raised, now fiercely defending a stranger who bought her affection with overnight shipping. If you open that box, you are telling her that 15 years of absence can be erased with a checkbook, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. Maya stared at me, tears spilling. Then I guess it is just a laptop to you, but to me it is the first time my mother ever remembered my existence, she sobbed. Maya grabbed the heavy box, turned her back on me, and marched into her bedroom. Moments later, she came back, carrying a duffel bag over her shoulder. I am going to stay at a dormitory for a few days, she announced coldly, not meeting my eyes. I need some space. I stood absolutely frozen in the middle of the kitchen, watching the heavy front door click shut behind her. Monica had casually shattered my home using nothing but a credit card. The emotional toll was heavy. I sank into a chair, wondering if I had lost the war. The house remained painfully quiet for the rest of the night. I did not bother turning on the television. I sat in the dark living room, staring at the empty driveway through the front window. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like a weight pressing down on my chest. I tried to convince myself that Maya would come to her senses, that the strong moral compass I had built inside her would win out. But the doubt gnawed at my tired mind. I was just a mechanic with dirty hands. How could I compete with her endless wealth? The sudden shrill ringing of my cell phone shattered the dead silence of the room. I glanced at the glowing green numbers on the digital clock resting on the mantel. It was 2 in the morning. Nobody calls an old man at 2 in the morning unless somebody has found a smoking gun. I snatched the phone off the coffee table and pressed it tightly against my ear. Hello, I answered. It was Victor Thorne. I have the preliminary results from the deep background check, Victor said, his tone sharp and completely devoid of emotion. I found the medical records. I found the financial trails. I found everything she has been trying to bury. I gripped the phone, holding my breath. What did you find? I asked. Victor paused for a fraction of a second, letting the gravity of his discovery settle over the line. Rick, your daughter was never in a psych ward, he stated coldly. She was in Vegas. Vegas. The word hung in the heavy air of my living room long after Victor hung up the phone. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in my worn armchair, watching the sun slowly rise over the quiet suburban street, waiting. At exactly 6 in the morning, a heavy thud echoed from my front porch. I opened the door to find a thick, unmarked manila envelope resting on the welcome mat. The dossier. I carried it to the kitchen table, the same table where my family fractured hours prior, and tore open the seal. Victor Thorne was an expensive ghost, but he was worth every single penny. The stack of papers inside was over 2 inches thick, filled with detailed financial records, sealed court transcripts, and grainy surveillance photographs. I poured myself a mug of black coffee, sat down heavily in my chair, and began to read the true story of my daughter. For 15 years, while I shivered under the hoods of rusting cars and struggled to keep the lights on, Monica lived a life of absolute luxury. The first section detailed her marriages. She did not wander blindly into a snowstorm and lose her memory. She took a bus straight to Nevada. Within 2 years of abandoning her children, she married a wealthy real estate broker in Las Vegas. That marriage lasted exactly 3 years before she divorced him, walking away with a massive alimony settlement. She did it again 4 years later, marrying a casino executive. Another divorce, another massive payout. Her third husband was a tech entrepreneur. She drained him too. She had millions at her disposal. She could have returned for her children any time. She could have helped me pay for their clothes, food, or college tuition. Instead, she chose to erase us completely. But the dirty money did not last. The next section of the dossier documented her rapid, catastrophic downfall. Monica developed a crippling gambling addiction. The bank statements Victor acquired showed hundreds of thousands bleeding out into high-stakes poker rooms and VIP baccarat tables. When her divorce settlements dried up, she turned to the wrong people. Included in the file were several photographs of Monica meeting with rough-looking men in dimly lit casino parking garages. Victor attached a handwritten sticky note to these photos. It read, "She owes a Vegas underground syndicate $2 million. They gave her 30 days to pay or they will break her legs." I set the coffee mug down. My hands were perfectly steady, but a cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. She was not a victim. She was a desperate animal backed into a corner by ruthless predators. But the dossier was not finished. There was a separate, brightly tabbed folder at the very bottom of the stack. It was simply labeled Bradley Peterson. I opened it and began scanning the corporate filings. Just as Tom suspected, Peterson was not an independent family law attorney. His prestigious Philadelphia law firm was merely a front. He was actually the lead in-house counsel for Apex Development, the massive corporate conglomerate quietly buying up all the industrial land in our newly rezoned district. Peterson was a ruthless corporate fixer. His entire job was to aggressively acquire properties standing in the way of the new commercial highway project, using any legal or illegal means necessary to force the current owners out. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped together in my mind. Apex Development needed my land to build their access road. They must have discovered that the property deed still had my late wife listed on it, making our estranged daughter a legal heir. They tracked Monica down in Las Vegas just as the syndicate was threatening to destroy her. They made a dark deal. They offered her a way out of her massive mob debt, and in exchange she would help them steal my home. But the absolute worst part was yet to come. I turned to the final page of the dossier, and my breath caught sharply in my throat. It was a copy of a complex legal contract heavily stamped and notarized just 2 weeks ago. I read the fine print, my eyes darting across the page in sheer horror. It was a binding pre-sale agreement. Monica had already secretly sold the entire property to Apex Development for $4.5 million. How could she sell land she did not legally own yet? I looked closer at the signature line. Attached to the contract was a second document, a power of attorney. It granted Monica full unilateral control over all of my personal and business assets. It falsely stated that I was mentally unfit and had willingly surrendered my estate to her care. And right there on the bottom right corner was my signature. I stared at the looping letters of my own name. It was a flawless, masterful forgery. They had somehow replicated my exact handwriting, likely pulling it from old public tax records. They had a corrupt notary stamp it. Monica and Peterson had already finalized the sale in the shadows. The $2 million from Apex was currently sitting in an escrow account, waiting to be released to the Vegas syndicate the exact second the judge ruled in her favor. The custody lawsuit was nothing but a smokescreen. It was a brilliant, cruel distraction designed to exhaust me emotionally and financially. If I lost the mediation, or if the judge granted her petition, based on her fake tears and the fabricated story of her mental health struggles, the forged power of attorney would instantly be legitimized by the court. The mob would get their money, Apex would get their access road, and I would be thrown out onto the street penniless, along with the 3 children I had bled to raise. I closed the thick dossier and took a deep breath. The ghost on the porch was actually a deadly assassin. I knew that simply walking into a courtroom and waving a private investigator report in the air would not be enough to stop a massive corporation. Apex Development was a billion-dollar machine. They had legions of lawyers who could easily dismiss the new dossier as circumstantial hearsay. I needed undeniable proof. I needed a direct confession from someone inside the belly of the beast. I scanned the dossier again and found a weak link. His name was Derek Shaw. He was a junior acquisitions executive at Apex, the man whose signature was right next to the escrow documents perfectly. Derek was young, ambitious, and likely completely unaccustomed to physical confrontation. He was the perfect target. The file included his daily routine. Every evening at exactly 7 at night, Derek left the glittering downtown Apex headquarters and walked to his reserved parking spot in a dimly lit private underground garage. I arrived an hour early. I parked my battered truck down the street and slipped into the garage through a side service door. I stood in the deep shadows behind a massive concrete pillar, the cold air seeping into my jacket. In my right hand I held a heavy wrench. Its heavy, greasy weight was familiar and comforting. Right on schedule, the heavy metal door to the elevator lobby clicked open. Derek Shaw walked out. He looked exactly like a man who destroyed lives for a living. He was wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit, talking loudly on his cell phone, twirling the keys to a brand new silver Mercedes-Benz. He walked toward his car completely oblivious to the world around him. I reached into my coat pocket, pressed the record button on my cell phone, and stepped out from the shadows without making a single careless sound. I did not say a word. I just walked straight up to the rear of his pristine Mercedes, raised the heavy steel wrench high above my head, and brought it down with every ounce of strength I had left in my old bones. The sickening crunch of shattering red plastic and crushed metal echoed violently through the empty concrete garage. Derek dropped his phone. He spun around, his face pale with sudden absolute terror. "Hey!" he screamed, his voice cracking like a frightened child. "What the hell are you doing? Are you crazy? I will call the police right now." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. I did not raise my voice. I did not have to. "I am Richard Gallagher," I said, tapping the heavy steel wrench gently against the palm of my left hand. "And you and your boss are currently trying to steal my home." Derek froze. The color drained entirely from his face. He recognized my name instantly. "Listen, man," he stammered, holding his hands up defensively and backing away until his tailored suit hit the cold concrete wall. "I just process the paperwork. I do not make the big strategic decisions at all." "You need to talk to Peterson," he begged. "Peterson is not here," I growled, taking another slow step closer until I was standing just inches from his terrified face. "You are. And you are going to tell me exactly how much Apex paid my daughter to file that fake custody lawsuit. If you lie to me, Derek, the next time I swing this wrench, it will not be at your expensive German car." He was shaking uncontrollably. The polished corporate predator was gone, replaced by a terrified kid who had never faced real consequences. "Please," he whispered in sheer panic. "Do not hurt me," he pleaded while looking frantically around the empty garage. "We paid her a $500,000 advance. It was a brilliant idea. The rest of the $2 million is sitting in an escrow account waiting for the judge to validate the forged document fully. She needed the money to pay off some really bad people in Nevada." I felt a cold rush of adrenaline. I had it on tape. But I needed one more piece of the puzzle. "Why are you so confident the judge will simply hand her the valuable property tomorrow morning anyway?" I demanded, pressing the cold steel of the wrench lightly against his expensive silk tie. Derek swallowed hard, a bead of sweat rolling down his forehead. "Because we own the judge," he blurted out, his voice trembling violently. "Judge Harrison. He has been on the Apex payroll for 3 years through blind campaign contributions. He has already agreed to rule in her favor at the hearing tomorrow. It does not matter what you say in court, Mr. Gallagher. The entire game is completely rigged. We are just waiting for the gavel to drop and take your beloved home away forever." The air in the garage felt suddenly suffocating. My victory over securing the confession turned instantly to ash in my mouth. The legal system was not just flawed, it was actively working against me. Apex had completely bought the referee. I slowly lowered the wrench and took a step back. Derek collapsed against his ruined car, gasping for air as if he had been drowning. I turned around and walked away, my boots echoing in the silence, leaving him trembling in the dark. I drove back toward my neighborhood, my mind racing through 100 different desperate contingency scenarios quietly. I finally turned onto my street, the familiar silhouette of my auto shop rising against the night sky. But as my headlights swept across the front of the building, my stomach violently dropped. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. Taped to the front door of my shop, glowing under the harsh orange light of the street lamp, was a massive bright yellow piece of paper. It was an immediate eviction order. Apex Development was not waiting for court. They were moving in early to demolish everything, and I had exactly 8 hours left to fight back. The eviction notice glued to my shop door felt like a blow to my chest, but I did not have the luxury of time to mourn my dying business. As I reached out to tear the paper from the glass, my cell phone began vibrating in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting another threat from Peterson or the junior executive I left trembling in the underground garage. Instead, the screen displayed Maya's name. I answered immediately, the cold wind whipping around my jacket. "Grandpa," she sobbed, her voice echoing with a panic I had never heard from her before. "I am at the university bursar's office, and they are threatening to drop me from the nursing program tomorrow morning." My heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" I asked softly, trying to project a calm strength I absolutely did not feel. "We paid your tuition last week, Maya." The check cleared. Maya let out a choked, desperate sound. "That is what I thought," she cried. "But the financial aid officer just told me the payment was completely reversed. The bank flagged the transaction and completely froze the entire college fund account. They said someone with a newly established power of attorney ordered an immediate freeze on all assets." The blood froze solid in my veins. The forged document. Apex Development and Monica had not just used the fake signature to orchestrate the secret property sale. They had weaponized it to systematically cut off my access to every single dime I had painstakingly saved over the past 15 years. They were starving me out. They wanted to ensure I did not have the financial resources to hire a decent lawyer to fight the eviction. But attacking Maya's education, the very future she had worked so incredibly hard to build, was a level of cruelty I could barely comprehend. "Maya, listen to me very carefully," I instructed, gripping the phone tightly. "Do not panic. I will figure this out. Just go back to your dormitory and wait for me. I am coming to pick you up right now." But Maya was not listening. I can hear the chaotic traffic noise in the background of her call. "No, Grandpa," she declared, her voice suddenly shifting from panic to a fragile, desperate anger. "She bought me a computer. She said she wanted to help me succeed in school. There has to be some kind of terrible mistake with the bank. I am driving to her hotel right now to figure this out." Before I could shout for her to stop, the line went completely dead. I drove frantically toward the downtown hotel district, praying I would reach her before she walked into the lion's den. But I was too late. Maya would later recount every agonizing detail of what happened in that opulent penthouse suite. She arrived at the luxurious hotel practically running past the valet and taking the golden elevator to the top floor. She knocked desperately on the heavy mahogany door of Monica's suite, clutching her nursing textbooks to her chest like a protective shield. When the door finally swung open, the weeping, tragic victim from the mediation room was nowhere to be found. Monica was wearing a plush silk robe holding a crystal glass of expensive champagne, looking mildly annoyed by the interruption. Maya, practically hyperventilating, tried to explain the terrible situation with the frozen bank account, begging her own mother to call the financial institution and fix the mistake so she would not lose her spot in the nursing program. Maya expected sympathy. She expected the loving mother who had sent her a brand new laptop just a few days prior to rush to her aid. Instead, Monica simply leaned against the heavy doorframe, took a slow sip of her champagne, and let out a cold, amused laugh. The sound of that laugh shattered the last remaining pieces of Maya's innocent hope. "You really think I care about your nursing classes?" Monica sneered, her eyes entirely devoid of maternal warmth. "I froze the accounts because your stubborn grandfather refuses to play nicely and hand over the property deed. If you want to stay in school, you should probably go convince him to sign the settlement papers tomorrow." Maya stood there, paralyzed, staring at the woman she had secretly defended. "But you said you wanted to help me," Maya whispered, tears spilling over her pale cheeks. Monica rolled her eyes, completely dropping the elaborate charade. "Oh, grow up," she sighed, dismissing the pain radiating from her daughter. "You are leverage, sweetheart. Nothing more. Tell the old man he has exactly 1 day left before I take everything." Then she gently closed the heavy door right in Maya's weeping face. I found Maya sitting on the cold concrete curb outside the hotel, shivering in the night air, the expensive laptop smashed to pieces in the nearby trash can. She looked so small, completely broken by the brutal reality of her mother's true nature. When she saw my battered truck pull up to the curb, she ran toward me and collapsed heavily into my arms. I wrapped my thick jacket tightly around her shaking shoulders. "I am so sorry. Grandpa," she sobbed into my chest, her voice wrecked with profound grief. "You were right about everything. She is a monster." I held my granddaughter fiercely, feeling her tears soaking through my shirt. I did not offer any empty platitudes. I did not tell her everything would magically be okay. I simply stared out into the dark, indifferent city streets as my sorrow hardened into absolute, unbreakable iron. The forged documents, the frozen accounts, the eviction notice, and the purchased judge. They had played their winning hand, but they had made one fatal mistake. They had broken my little girl's heart. I kissed the top of Maya's head, my eyes cold with an ancient, terrifying fury. "I am going to destroy her," I whispered to the night. "The war is on." I drove Maya back to our small, quiet house in absolute silence. The bright yellow eviction notice I had hastily ripped from the shop door was folded in my pocket, burning like a hot coal against my chest. We had exactly 48 hours before the scheduled court hearing, and only slightly longer before Apex Development brought the bulldozers to crush my livelihood into dust. I tucked Maya into her childhood bed. She was exhausted, her spirit broken by the brutal betrayal of the woman who brought her into this world. I closed her bedroom door softly. I did not sleep. I waited for the morning sun to rise. First thing in the morning, I barged into Tom O'Connor's downtown law office. I dropped the bright yellow eviction notice and Victor Thorne's thick dossier squarely onto his cluttered desk. Tom looked up from his legal pads. I told him everything that happened the previous night. I told him about the terrified junior executive in the parking garage, the frozen college funds, and the cruel reality of the purchased judge. Tom did not interrupt. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed his temples, letting out a long, heavy sigh. "Rick, we are completely out of time," Tom finally said, his deep voice grave. "The forged power of attorney is a masterpiece of corporate fraud. We can challenge it, but proving forgery takes months of handwriting analysis. We do not have months. We have exactly 2 days. If Judge Harrison is already in their pocket, he will rubber stamp the eviction and validate the property sale before we can even file a formal objection." Then we attacked the root of the lie I fired back leaning over his desk. We attacked the custody petition. She claimed she was locked in a psychiatric ward against her will. The private investigator proved she was gambling in Las Vegas and marrying rich men. We show that to the court. Tom shook his head slowly. It is not that simple, my friend, he explained softly. You are going up against a deeply entrenched bias in the family court system. The courts inherently favor the biological mother. Bradley Peterson has built a brilliant, impenetrable narrative. He will argue that her time in Vegas was a direct symptom of her severe mental breakdown. He will bring in paid medical experts to testify that her gambling addiction and erratic marriages were trauma responses to losing her children. They will spin her into a sympathetic victim of an illness she could not control. I stared at him, the bitter taste of defeat rising in my throat. So you are telling me she can abandon her babies, steal millions of dollars, forge my name, freeze my granddaughter out of college, and the court will just hand her a tissue and a check? I asked, my voice rising with anger. I am telling you that without absolute, irrefutable proof of her malicious intent, the court will give her the benefit of the doubt, Tom replied. We desperately need a real silver bullet, Rick. We need physical evidence from 15 years ago proving she was completely lucid, entirely selfish, and willingly chose to discard her family for financial gain. We need proof she abandoned them on purpose, not out of sickness. Without that, Peterson's rehabilitation story wins the judge rules in her favor, and you lose everything. I left his office feeling a suffocating despair. I drove back to my house under a sky that had turned a bruised, violent shade of purple. Dark storm clouds were rolling in quickly from the west, bringing a sudden chill to the air. By the time I parked in my driveway, heavy drops of rain were beginning to fall, splashing violently against the cracked concrete. I walked inside and sat down heavily in my worn armchair. The house was dead quiet save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the front window. I closed my tired eyes and listened to the storm. The sound of the heavy rain hitting the glass triggered something buried deep within the dusty archives of my memory. I sat up slowly, my heart beating faster. It was raining just like this on that terrible night 15 years ago. It was a torrential, howling storm that flooded the streets. I remembered opening the front door and finding the 3 terrified toddlers huddled together under the porch awning, shivering in the cold, damp air. But there was something else, a detail I had pushed down into the darkness because the pain was simply too great to bear. I remembered carrying the crying children inside, grabbing towels to dry their wet hair. And then I remembered the sound. In the chaotic noise of the storm and the crying babies, a small mechanical click had echoed from the corner of the room. I stood up from my chair, my breathing suddenly shallow. I looked toward the old wooden bookshelf where we used to keep the house telephone. 15 years ago, we did not have advanced smartphones or digital voicemails. We had an old, heavy Panasonic answering machine. It used tiny microcassette tapes to record incoming messages. I remembered looking over at the machine that night. I remembered the small red light blinking aggressively in the dark room. Monica had called me. She had left a message right before she dropped the kids on the porch and vanished into the storm. I had listened to it once, collapsed onto the floor in a state of pure, agonizing shock, and then I ripped the machine from the wall because I could not bear to hear her cruel voice ever again. I packed the broken machine into a cardboard box and shoved it into the attic, vowing to protect my grandchildren from the toxic poison on that tape. My eyes darted toward the ceiling. The attic. The absolute physical proof of her willing abandonment. The silver bullet. The old answering machine was still up there. I did not waste another second. I marched down the hallway and banged heavily on the boys' bedroom doors. Tyler and Leo emerged looking exhausted and confused by my sudden urgency. I told them we had exactly 10 hours before the sun came up, and the court took everything we owned. I told them about the old Panasonic answering machine, the one I had ripped out of the wall 15 years ago, and the microcassette tape still trapped inside it. The tape that held their mother's true voice. Leo did not ask any questions. He just nodded, his jaw set. Tyler followed right behind him, pulling the heavy wooden stepladder down from the ceiling hatch. A cloud of stale, suffocating dust cascaded down over us as the hinges squealed in protest. We climbed up into the darkness. The attic was a massive, claustrophobic cavern of forgotten history. The air up there was thick, dry, and tasted heavily of old fiberglass insulation and decaying cardboard. It was a suffocating heat that immediately pressed down on my chest, making it difficult to draw a full breath. A single bare incandescent bulb hung from a frayed wire in the center of the room. It cast long, monstrous shadows across the towering stacks of boxes. We had used this space as a dumping ground for a decade and a half. Every broken appliance, every piece of outgrown clothing, and every discarded memory had been shoved up here to gather dust. Now it was a minefield we had to carefully excavate. We only had until morning to find a plastic box no bigger than a dictionary. We divided the attic into 3 separate sections and started tearing through the mountains of cardboard. The physical struggle was immediate and punishing. I dropped to my aching knees. I dragged heavy plastic bins across the splintered wooden floorboards. Sweat stung my eyes, mixing with the thick layer of grime coating my hands. Tyler was working frantically near the back wall, slicing open taped boxes with his pocket knife, tossing aside old winter coats and moth-eaten blankets. Leo was tearing through a pile of rusted car parts and old metal shelving near the chimney. The silence of the house below was replaced by the frantic sounds of ripping cardboard, sliding bins, and our heavy, ragged breathing. Every passing minute felt like a heavy stone sitting on my chest. As we dug deeper into the piles, the attic began to reveal the true story of the life I had built for them. I opened a taped box and pulled out a small, worn leather baseball glove. It was the one I had bought for Tyler when he was 8 years old. I had worked 3 consecutive weekend shifts at the auto shop just to afford it so he could join the neighborhood Little League team. Right beneath it was a faded cardboard volcano from Maya's 5th grade science fair, painted with bright, sloppy colors we had mixed together on the floor. Next to that was a plastic bin entirely filled with Leo's tiny baby clothes, the ones I had painstakingly washed by hand when the washing machine broke down and I could not afford to fix it. Every single item we touched was a silent, undeniable testament to the massive sacrifices I had made. Monica wanted to convince a judge that she was the loving mother who was tragically separated from her children. But the absolute truth was buried right here in this suffocating, dusty room. She was not the one who bought the baseball gloves or built the science projects. She was not the one who stayed up all night washing baby clothes. I was. I had given them my youth, my savings, and my entire heart, and I was completely damned if I was going to let her erase my history and steal their future just because she learned how to cry on command. I shoved the box of baby clothes aside and kept digging, my fingers raw and bleeding. 3 grueling hours passed. The single light bulb flickered violently above us. My lungs were burning from the heavy dust, and a sharp shooting pain radiated down my lower back. Tyler sat back on his heels, wiping a thick layer of sweat and dirt from his forehead, looking around at the endless sea of unchecked boxes with a growing sense of total despair. "Grandpa, I do not see it anywhere," Tyler whispered, his voice cracking with pure exhaustion. "Maybe you threw it away. Maybe it got lost when we fixed the roof 5 years ago." I shook my head stubbornly, refusing to accept defeat. I did not throw it away, I wheezed, forcing myself to stand back up. "Keep looking. Tear open every single bag. It has to be here. We cannot stop now." We went back to work, moving with a desperate, frantic energy fueled by pure adrenaline and fear. Suddenly, from the darkest, most cramped corner of the attic, Leo let out a sharp gasp. "I found something," he called out, his voice echoing loudly in the tight space. Tyler and I scrambled over the piles of junk, our boots slipping on the dusty floorboards, until we reached him. Leo was kneeling beside an incredibly heavy, severely rusted metal toolbox. It was completely buried beneath a stack of old tires and broken wooden dining chairs. I recognized it. It was the heavy metal toolbox I used to keep in the back of my old towing truck before the transmission finally gave out. I had packed broken items inside it before hauling it up here years ago. Leo grabbed the rusted latch and yanked it open. A cloud of red rust flakes floated into the air. We all leaned forward, staring down into the deep, shadowy metal compartment. Resting right at the very bottom was the old Panasonic answering machine. My heart leaped into my throat, but then the grim reality set in. It was completely crushed. I stared down at the crushed plastic casing of the answering machine, my heart sinking in my chest. The heavy metal toolbox had protected it from the worst of the moisture, but the sheer weight of the scrap metal pressing down on it for 15 years had cracked the outer shell. Tyler let out a long, defeated groan. "It is broken," he whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying finality. "We went through all of this for nothing." Leo did not say a word. He just stared blankly at the ruined machine, the last spark of hope dying in his eyes. I reached into the rusted toolbox and gently lifted the device. The plastic fragments crumbled under my calloused fingers. I could see the tiny microcassette tape still wedged inside the plastic carriage. The tape itself looked intact. The fragile magnetic ribbon was wound around the miniature plastic spools, but the mechanical components surrounding it were a disaster. The drive belt was dry-rotted and snapped. The small electrical motor that powered the spindles was corroded, covered in a layer of white battery acid from the batteries that had leaked over a decade ago. "Do not give up yet," I told the boys, my voice firm. "It is a machine, and a machine is just a collection of parts working together. If a part is broken, we replace it. If the connection is lost, we rewire it. I have spent my entire life bringing dead engines back to life. I am not going to let this piece of plastic beat me. Follow me down to the garage." We climbed down from the suffocating heat of the attic and marched out into the cold, damp air of the repair shop. The rain was still drumming against the tin roof, a constant reminder of the storm from 15 years ago. I cleared off my wooden workbench, sweeping aside heavy wrenches and greasy rags to make room for our desperate surgery. I pulled my bright desk lamp down close, flooding the work surface with a glaring white light. I opened my smallest toolbox, the one holding precision instruments I usually reserved for rebuilding delicate fuel injectors. I pulled out a magnifying glass on an adjustable stand and a set of miniature flathead screwdrivers. Tyler and Leo stood still on either side of me, watching in breathless silence. I positioned the magnifying glass over the crushed answering machine and went to work. My hands are large, scarred, and stained with black grease. They were built for swinging heavy hammers and torquing lug nuts on diesel trucks. They were not built for this kind of microscopic surgery. But as I carefully pried the cracked plastic casing apart, peeling back the damaged shell to expose the fragile green circuit board beneath my hands did not shake. The fierce protective love for my family steadied my nerves. I successfully extracted the microcassette tape and set it aside on a clean rag. Now came the impossible part. I tested the miniature motor with a voltage meter. Nothing. The internal coils were fried by the battery acid. "We cannot play the tape without a functioning motor to spin the magnetic heads," I muttered, wiping my brow. "We need a donor motor. Something with a volt output that is small enough to fit into this housing." Leo perked up. "What about my old electric train set?" he asked, his voice echoing in the quiet shop. "The locomotive had a small electric motor inside it. You fixed it for me when I was 7. I looked up at him, a sudden surge of hope rushing through my veins. The train set. It was sitting in a cardboard box on the bottom shelf of the storage closet. "Run and get it," I ordered, "right now." Leo sprinted across the shop and returned seconds later with the dusty locomotive. I grabbed my screwdriver and cracked the toy open without a second thought. There it was, a pristine, tiny electric motor sitting intact inside the plastic chassis. It was a miracle of mechanical compatibility. I snipped the wires and pulled the small silver cylinder free. The next hour was the most grueling, stressful mechanical work I had ever performed in my 77 years. I had to retrofit the toy train motor into the housing of the answering machine. I used a pair of fine needle-nose pliers to strip the incredibly thin copper wires. I needed to splice the power supply from the answering machine circuit board directly into the new motor. One wrong move, one slipped tool, and I would sever the connection, destroying our only piece of evidence. I held my breath as I twisted the copper strands together. My vision blurred slightly from staring through the magnifying glass for so long, but I blinked the strain away and kept moving. Tyler handed me a roll of electrical tape, and I wrapped the tiny exposed splices. Finally, I stretched a small rubber band from a bundle of receipts to act as a makeshift drive belt, looping it over the plastic gears. It was a chaotic mess of wires and plastic held together by sheer willpower and mechanical instinct. I gently placed the microcassette tape back into the reconstructed carriage. I took a deep breath, the heavy scent of motor oil filling my lungs. This was it. We had no more time left. The sun was going to rise in a few hours. I grabbed a 9-volt battery from my desk drawer. Tyler and Leo leaned in close, their faces pale and drawn with tension. I lined up the positive and negative terminals. I looked at my 2 boys, the children I had fought so hard to protect. I pressed the battery against the exposed copper wires. A sharp blue spark popped from the connection. A quiet mechanical hum vibrated through the workbench. The rubber band pulled tight against the plastic gears. The tiny spindles inside the microcassette began to spin. A harsh grating burst of static erupted from the small speaker, echoing loudly in the damp silence of the garage. I held the battery contacts steady, my hands locked in place by sheer adrenaline. The static hissed and popped, sounding like the rushing wind of that terrible storm from 15 years ago. Tyler and Leo leaned in closer, their eyes fixated on the rigged machine, their breathing completely suspended. For a terrifying moment, I thought the magnetic ribbon had degraded too much to hold any sound. I thought the years of brutal heat and freezing cold up in the attic had erased the only evidence that could save us. But then, cutting straight through the heavy white noise, a voice pierced the quiet garage. It was a voice I had not heard in a decade and a half. It was completely clear, sharp and dripping with a cold, terrifying impatience. "Dad, pick up the phone. I know you are there. Pick it up." Tyler flinched. He took a slow step back, his eyes widening in absolute shock. He was 8 years old, the last time he heard that voice. But the visceral reaction in his body told me his childhood memories were rushing back in a violent flood. Leo just stared at the spinning tape, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. The recording continued, the background noise filled with the sound of a revving car engine and pouring rain. "Listen to me, Dad. I do not have time to argue with you, so I am just going to leave this message. I left the kids on your front porch. Do not bother looking for me. I am gone." The absolute lack of emotion in her tone was staggering. There was no hesitation. There was no tearful goodbye. There was absolutely no mention of a psychiatric ward or a desperate struggle with postpartum depression. It was the voice of a woman who was tossing aside a heavy burden with profound, unapologetic relief. I watched my grandsons process the brutal reality of their own mother. "I am taking the $50,000 life insurance check from my deadbeat ex-husband," she continued, her voice rising slightly over the sound of the rain. "That money belongs to me. It is mine. Those kids are nothing but a massive anchor dragging me down, and I am finally cutting the rope. I do not care what you do with them. Keep them. Throw them in a state orphanage. Give them to the foster system. It makes absolutely no difference to me." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the garage as the recording played out her ultimate betrayal. I left the official abandonment papers in the front pocket of the blue backpack, the voice sneered coldly. "I signed them and had them perfectly notarized this morning. You have full legal custody now. Do not ever try to call this number again. I am starting my real life today. Goodbye, old man. A sharp click echoed from the tiny speaker, followed by the returning hiss of empty static. I pulled the battery away, stopping the improvised motor. The sudden silence in the shop was deafening. I slowly looked up at my 2 grandsons. I had spent 15 years desperately trying to shield them from the venomous truth of that message. I had carried the heavy burden of her cruelty alone so they could sleep at night, believing they were inherently lovable. But standing here now, bathed in the harsh white light of my workbench, I realized they needed to hear it. Tyler was crying. He was not crying out of sorrow or a desperate longing for a mother. He was weeping with a profound, overwhelming sense of relief. The heavy, invisible chain of guilt he had carried his entire life, the secret fear that he had somehow driven his mother away by being a difficult child, shattered completely. He wiped his eyes with the back of his greasy sleeve and let out a long, shaky breath. "She really never loved us," he whispered, his voice trembling, but remarkably clear. "It was never our fault." Leo walked slowly up to the workbench. The fiery, violent rage that usually burned in his eyes was entirely gone. It was replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. He looked at the rigged answering machine and then turned to me. "She threw us away like garbage," Leo said, his voice flat and dead. "But you picked us up. You gave up your entire life to build ours. She is a complete stranger, Grandpa. And tomorrow we are going to walk into that courtroom and bury her." I reached out and pulled both of my boys into a tight, fierce embrace. The smell of motor oil and old sweat surrounded us. We stood there together, a fractured family forged into solid steel by the fires of betrayal. We finally had our silver bullet. We had the irrefutable, undeniable proof that would completely destroy the fabricated narrative of a tragically depressed mother. But our victory was violently interrupted. A sharp snapping sound echoed from the workbench. We pulled apart and looked down. The fragile 15-year-old magnetic tape stressed beyond its limits by the improvised motor, and the rubber band drive belt had snapped in half. The thin brown ribbons spilled out of the tiny plastic cassette casing, curling uselessly onto the greasy wooden table. My heart slammed against my aching ribs. The primary evidence was entirely destroyed. The audio had not been digitally transferred anywhere. The delicate tape was completely physically severed. Tyler gasped, grabbing his dark hair in sheer, unadulterated panic. "We lost it," he cried out desperately. "We just lost absolutely everything today." I stared silently at the broken brown ribbon resting on the worn wood. I did not panic at all. I reached forward for my precision tweezers. I have exactly 3 full hours until court. I grabbed the tweezers. My hands had rebuilt shattered transmissions, and they were not going to fail me now. I instructed Tyler to hold the 2 broken ends of the magnetic ribbon perfectly flat against the workbench. I took a sliver of clear tape, held my breath, and bridged the gap between the snapped pieces. It was an incredibly fragile splice. If the playback machine caught the edge, it would tear the spool to shreds, but it was our only chance. I wound the repaired ribbon back into the carriage, sealed it with glue, and placed the cassette gently into my breast pocket, right over my heart. We washed our hands, dressed, and drove downtown. The heavy stone steps of the county courthouse loomed before us like a fortress. Maya was waiting for us by the massive bronze doors, her eyes red from crying all night, but her posture was rigid and defiant. She hugged her brothers tightly, a silent vow of absolute solidarity. We walked through the metal detectors and took the echoing elevator up to the 4th-floor family court division. Tom was already waiting in the crowded hallway. He looked tired, clutching his worn leather briefcase like a shield. Before he could ask about our midnight search, the double doors at the end of the corridor swung wide open. Bradley Peterson walked out looking like a shark smelling blood in the water. He was wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, his artificial smile firmly in place. Walking beside him was Monica. She had perfectly calibrated her appearance for the impending trial. She wore a conservative navy dress, her hair pulled back, simply clutching a tissue in her trembling hands. The hallway was packed with other families, lawyers, and court staff waiting for their hearings. Monica immediately noticed the large audience. She let out a loud theatrical sob and rushed toward us, her arms outstretched like a desperate child seeking forgiveness. "Dad," she cried out, her voice echoing loudly off the marble walls. "Dad, please. We do not have to do this. I do not want to fight you in there. I just want my family back." People in the hallway stopped and stared, their faces softening with misplaced sympathy for the weeping mother. I stood perfectly still, letting her fake tears wash over me without moving a muscle. Bradley stepped smoothly between us, holding his hands up in a gesture of manufactured peace. "Mr. Gallagher," he said, his voice loud enough for bystanders to hear. "My client is absolutely heartbroken today. She recognizes the immense sacrifices you made while she was battling her severe medical trauma in isolation. We want to offer a peaceful resolution." Bradley reached into his suit coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of thick paper. He handed it directly to Tom. Tom opened the paper, his eyes scanning the official bank watermark. He looked up at me, his expression completely unreadable. "It is a certified bank check." "Rick," Tom murmured, keeping his voice extremely low so only we could hear. "$500,000. Bradley smiled, stepping much closer to me. $500,000 completely tax-free, Bradley whispered coldly. "You sign the property over right now and you walk away a rich man. You can buy a nice little house in Florida. You can pay for Maya to attend school. If we walk into that courtroom, Judge Harrison is going to strip you of everything and you will leave with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back. Take it, Rick. Be a smart man for once in your miserable life." Tom placed his hand gently on my shoulder. "Rick, you need to think about this logically," he whispered. "I know what we discussed, but the system is entirely rigged against us. If the judges bought that spliced tape in your pocket, might not even be admitted into evidence. $500,000 is enough to secure the kids' futures. You could finally retire. You could rest." I looked down at the certified check resting in his hand. $500,000. It was more money than I had ever seen in my entire 77 years on this earth. It was a golden ticket out of the grease and the punishing poverty. It was the absolute easiest, safest path. I looked at Monica. She was watching me intently, her fake tears drying up as the sheer greed danced in her cold eyes. She glanced down nervously at her feet, and I saw them again. The $2,000 designer shoes. She thought I was just a tired old mechanic who could be easily bought off with a fraction of what my land was truly worth. She thought the deep love I had for my grandchildren was something she could simply put a price tag on and purchase like a used car. I looked at Tyler. I looked at Leo. I looked at Maya. Their faces were pale, watching me silently, waiting to see if the grandfather who had raised them would finally surrender to the massive corporate machine. They did not care about the money. They only cared about the truth. I reached out and took the certified check from his hand. The lawyer smiled into a victorious grin. He thought he had completely won. I held the heavy paper between my calloused, grease-stained fingers. I stared right into her eyes, letting her see the absolute terrifying emptiness of my forgiveness. Slowly, deliberately, I ripped the check right down the middle. Bradley gasped, stepping back in sudden shock. Her jaw dropped. I put the two halves together and tore them again and again until the massive corporate bribe was nothing but tiny, worthless shreds of paper. I opened my hand and let the pieces flutter to the cold marble floor, landing perfectly across the tops of her expensive designer shoes. I leaned in close, my voice a dangerous, gravelly whisper. "I will see you in hell, sweetheart." The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B swung open, and we walked into the slaughterhouse. The gallery was packed. Word had spread around the courthouse about the property dispute. Reporters and curious onlookers filled the wooden benches, their hushed whispers dying down the moment we walked down the center aisle. I took my seat at the defense table with Tom. Maya, Tyler, and Leo sat directly behind me in the first row, their presence a solid wall of support against my back. Across the aisle, Monica and Bradley Peterson were seated. They looked like a picture of polished grace. Judge Harrison entered the room, his robe billowing behind him. He was a stern man with silver hair and cold, calculating eyes. Knowing what Derek had confessed in the parking garage, looking at the judge made my stomach churn with disgust. The system was rigged, and the man holding the gavel was the puppet master. The bailiff called the court to order, and Bradley Peterson stood up to deliver his opening statement. He did not merely present a legal argument. He launched an assassination of my character. Pacing slowly in front of the judge, his shoes tapping against the hardwood floor, Bradley pointed an accusing finger at me. He painted me not as a loving grandfather who stepped up when nobody else would, but as a tyrannical, controlling patriarch. He claimed I was a bitter, angry man who had driven my daughter into a state of psychological distress. According to his twisted narrative, I was a jealous guardian who had alienated my grandchildren from their rightful mother out of spite. He spoke of my modest repair shop, not as a place of honest labor, but as a dangerous, toxic environment where I had forcibly trapped 3 innocent children in a cycle of poverty and emotional manipulation. He spun a tale so dark and convincing that I could actually feel the people in the gallery shifting uncomfortably behind me, their sympathy turning rapidly against the old mechanic, with grease permanently stained into his knuckles. Then came the main event. Bradley called Monica to the witness stand. She walked slowly, her head bowed, clutching a fresh tissue in her trembling hands. The moment she sat down and took the oath, the performance began. She looked directly at the judge, her eyes wide and swimming with tears. Bradley asked his first question, his voice dripping with manufactured gentleness, asking her to recall the night she left. Monica broke down. It was a flawless, Oscar-worthy display of fabricated grief. She sobbed softly, her voice shaking, as she described a fictional descent into a terrifying postpartum psychosis. She painted a vivid, agonizing picture of wandering the streets in the freezing rain, entirely out of her mind, desperately trying to find a hospital to get the psychiatric help she believed she needed to be a good mother. She swore under oath that she was picked up by authorities in a neighboring state, misidentified, and thrown into a locked psychiatric ward where she was heavily sedated against her will for years. She described the absolute agony of waking up in a padded room, screaming for her children, only to be ignored by indifferent doctors. I sat perfectly still, my jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. Every single word falling from her mouth was pure, unadulterated poison. But she did not stop there. Bradley guided her toward the most devastating lie of all. He asked her what she did when she finally regained her freedom. Monica turned her tear-streaked face toward the gallery, ensuring every single person in the room could see her profound pain. She claimed she came looking for us immediately. She testified that she drove back to our old neighborhood, only to find that I had vanished. She swore before God and the court that she spent every single day of the last 10 years desperately searching for her babies. She described hiring private investigators she could not afford, posting flyers, and crying herself to sleep every night in empty apartments, wondering if her children were safe. She looked at Tyler, Maya, and Leo, reaching her hand out toward them across the courtroom. "I never stopped loving you," she wept, her voice breaking perfectly. "I never stopped looking for you. Your grandfather hid you from me because he wanted to punish me for getting sick." The courtroom was silent, save for the sound of her tragic, echoing sobs. I looked up at Judge Harrison. His expression had softened dramatically. He was leaning forward, nodding gently with a look of deep, profound paternal sympathy. The purchased judge was playing his part beautifully, selling the illusion of a fair trial to the packed room. He looked at me with open disgust, the narrative of the abusive, kidnapping grandfather firmly established in the official record. I could feel the crushing weight of the room pressing down on my shoulders. Maya let out a quiet, furious breath behind me, and I reached back, placing my hand over hers to keep her steady. The urge to stand up and scream the truth was nearly unbearable, but I forced myself to remain anchored to the chair. I could feel the hard plastic casing of the repaired microcassette tape pressing warmly against my chest, right over my furiously beating heart. It was the only thing keeping me from losing my mind. Bradley Peterson walked back to his table, a look of arrogant triumph plastered across his slick face. He had won the crowd, the judge, and the moral high ground. He turned to the bench, buttoning his expensive suit jacket with a final, authoritative flourish. "Your Honor," Bradley said, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable confidence. "The plaintiff has suffered enough at the hands of this man. We proudly rest our case." He sat down, smiling smugly in my direction. The trap had been sprung, and looking around the silent judging courtroom, it looked like I had just lost everything. The heavy silence in the courtroom was broken by Tom calling my name. I stood up from the defense table. My knees popped loudly. I walked slowly toward the witness stand. I could feel the hostile glare of the packed gallery pressing against my back. I placed my right hand on the Bible, swore to tell the absolute truth, and sat down in the hard wooden chair. I looked out over the sea of faces. I saw Monica looking at me with fake pity and genuine malice. I saw Bradley Peterson organizing his notes, ready to tear my life apart. I saw my 3 grandchildren sitting perfectly still, their eyes locked onto mine. Tom began with a brief, direct examination. He asked about the night the children were left on my porch. He asked about the decades I spent working 16-hour shifts to keep a roof over their heads. I answered simply and honestly. I did not raise my voice, I could see Judge Harrison shifting impatiently in his high leather chair, his mind completely made up. After 10 minutes, Tom thanked me and returned to his seat. Then it was Bradley Peterson's turn. He buttoned his expensive charcoal suit jacket and approached the witness stand like a predator circling a wounded animal. He started his cross-examination with a deeply insulting observation. He looked down at my hands resting on the wooden railing. He pointed out the permanent black grease stained deep into the creases of my knuckles. He asked if I ever bothered to wash my hands before cooking dinner for 3 growing children. He asked if the fumes from my failing repair shop were the reason we lived in persistent poverty. He was deliberately trying to make me angry. He wanted the judge to see a volatile old man who could not control his temper. I did not give him the satisfaction. I sat there like a statue forged from cold iron. I answered his insulting questions with a calm, flat tone. "Yes, my hands are dirty," I replied. "I am a mechanic. I fix things that are broken." I looked directly into his slick, confident face. Bradley scoffed and paced back and forth across the polished hardwood floor. He pivoted his attack toward my finances. He listed my meager bank account balances. He brought up the months we had to eat canned soup and the winters we wore extra sweaters because I could not afford to fix the broken furnace. He asked how a man with such pathetic financial resources could possibly believe he was equipped to raise 3 small children alone. He accused me of being selfish for not handing them over to the foster system, where they might have had a better chance at a comfortable life. I took the heavy hits. I let his cruel, venomous words wash over me without flinching. I knew exactly what he was doing. I was giving him rope. I was letting him build the tallest, most arrogant tower of lies possible, so the fall would be absolutely devastating. When the financial insults failed to break my composure, Bradley moved to the core of his fabricated case. He raised his voice loudly, pointing an accusatory finger right at my chest. He demanded to know why I never tried to find my poor, deeply suffering daughter. He accused me of deliberately hiding her children out of sheer vindictive spite. He asked if I felt any remorse for stealing 15 years of a loving mother's life just because I was angry she needed medical help. The gallery whispered in shock at his aggressive tone. Judge Harrison leaned forward, glaring at me over his silver spectacles, silently commanding me to confess my supposed sins. Monica quickly covered her face with her hands, letting out another perfectly timed, very tragic sob. I looked at Monica. I looked at the tears leaking through her fingers. I thought about the forged property deed, the frozen college funds, and the $2 million mob debt waiting in Las Vegas. I thought about the terrifying, heartless cruelty it took to look at her own weeping daughter in a hotel room and call her leverage. I kept my voice incredibly steady. I did not hide them, I stated very clearly. I protected them. Bradley let out a loud, mocking laugh. You protected them from their own mother, he sneered, turning his back on me to face the gallery. You are nothing but a controlling, bitter old man who selfishly kidnapped his own flesh and blood. Bradley Peterson slowly walked back to his table, a look of absolute triumph on his face. He looked at Judge Harrison and nodded confidently. No further questions for this witness, Your Honor, Bradley declared loudly. He sat down next to Monica, whispering something into her ear that made her nod in agreement. They thought they had entirely destroyed my credibility. They thought the trial was effectively over. Judge Harrison looked down at me from his elevated bench, a deep, dark scowl settling on his face. He opened his mouth, likely preparing to dismiss me from the stand and issue his final, completely rigged ruling. Before the judge could speak, the heavy wooden chair at the defense table scraped loudly against the floor. Tom O'Connor finally stood up. He did not look intimidated. He looked like a seasoned hunter who had just watched his prey step perfectly into a steel trap. He walked slowly toward the center of the courtroom. The energy in the room instantly shifted. The arrogant smiles on the faces of Monica and her corporate lawyer faltered. Tom stopped in front of the witness stand. Redirect, Your Honor, Tom requested calmly. He did not wait for the judge to grant permission. He turned his focus directly to me. The large courtroom fell completely silent. Tom took a very deep breath. Mr. Gallagher, did your daughter leave a voice message on the exact night she disappeared? Yes, she did. I answered, my voice steady and very clear so everyone in the courtroom could hear. She left a message on my answering machine. A loud murmur rippled quickly through the packed gallery. Bradley Peterson jumped to his feet, objecting aggressively, claiming this was a desperate, last-minute fabrication. Judge Harrison banged his wooden gavel, looking at Tom with deep, unmistakable suspicion. Tom did not flinch. He simply thanked me, stated he had no further questions for me at this time, and formally requested permission to recall the plaintiff, Monica Gallagher, to the witness stand for additional cross-examination. Judge Harrison looked like he wanted to deny the request immediately, but he knew the courtroom was heavily packed with eager reporters. Refusing a basic cross-examination in front of the press would look like a blatant miscarriage of justice. He ground his teeth and angrily ordered Monica back to the stand. Monica stood up from her table. She smoothed down her conservative navy dress and walked slowly back to the wooden chair. She did not look like a weeping victim anymore. There was a hard, incredibly irritated edge to her rigid posture. She sat down, glaring at Tom with absolute, unfiltered contempt. She thought she had already won the trial, and this was just a pathetic, dying gasp from a defeated old mechanic. Tom walked confidently up to the wooden podium, resting his hands firmly on the heavy edges. He looked at her with the calm, terrifying patience of a seasoned man who held all the winning cards. Miss Gallagher, Tom began, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. I want to remind you that you are still currently under oath. Do you completely understand what that serious obligation means? Monica rolled her eyes slightly, a subtle gesture of pure, unadulterated arrogance. Yes, I clearly understand, she replied coldly. Tom nodded slowly. Then you also understand that perjury, the deliberate act of intentionally lying under oath in a court of law, is a severe felony in this state, punishable by significant mandatory prison time. Monica stiffened slightly, glancing quickly at Bradley Peterson, who gave her a reassuring, confident nod. I know what perjury is, she snapped defensively. I have told nothing but the absolute truth today. Excellent, Tom replied smoothly. Because I want to give you one final formal opportunity to clarify your previous sworn testimony. Your entire legal case rests on the fundamental premise that your departure 15 years ago was the tragic unintended result of a severe, uncontrollable mental health crisis. You explicitly testified that you wandered blindly into a freezing storm entirely incapacitated and were locked away inside a medical facility against your will. Is that still your official sworn testimony today? Monica lifted her chin defiantly. Yes, it absolutely is. I was incredibly sick. I did not know what I was doing. Tom stepped away from the podium and walked much closer to the elevated witness stand. So you are stating for the official court record under the direct penalty of perjury that you did not willingly, intentionally, and voluntarily abandon your 3 young children on your father's front porch. Monica glared at him, her pale hands gripping the wooden railing of the witness box incredibly tightly. I swear it, she said fiercely. I never wanted to leave my beautiful babies. I was terribly sick. Tom paused, letting her massive lie hang heavily in the completely silent courtroom. He took another small, deliberate step closer. Let us talk about your precise financial situation on the exact night you disappeared. Tom continued, his deep voice dropping to a dangerous, interrogating tone. You testified earlier that you were utterly destitute when you were allegedly committed to this mysterious psychiatric ward. I want to ask you specifically about a $50,000 life insurance check from your deceased ex-husband. Did you intentionally take that money with you when you left? Bradley Peterson stood up to object aggressively, but Tom kept his piercing blue eyes locked directly on Monica. Monica swallowed hard, a brief, undeniable flash of genuine panic crossing her pale face before she buried it completely under her practiced mask of righteous indignation. No, she declared loudly, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. I did not take any money at all. I had absolutely nothing. I was a sick, helpless woman wandering aimlessly in the freezing rain. Tom nodded slowly, his facial expression entirely unreadable. He was systematically locking the heavy iron cage around her, ensuring there was absolutely no possible escape from the trap he had meticulously constructed. Tom paced slowly back to his wooden table. He looked at Tyler, Maya, and Leo sitting directly behind me in the gallery. He looked back at Monica, his eyes suddenly burning with a fierce, deeply protective anger. Miss Gallagher, Tom said, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. When you left your 3 beautiful, innocent children in the freezing rain 15 years ago, did you at any point instruct your father to throw them into a state orphanage? Did you explicitly tell him to give them away to the foster care system because you considered them to be nothing but a massive anchor dragging you down? The entire courtroom gasped collectively. The sheer, unimaginable cruelty of the specific question sent a massive shockwave through the packed gallery. Judge Harrison leaned violently forward, his face turning a dark, furious shade of red. Bradley Peterson shouted an objection, demanding Tom be sanctioned for badgering the witness with completely baseless, thoroughly disgusting accusations. But Monica was far too angry to let her expensive lawyer handle it. The carefully constructed mask of the weeping, tragic victim completely and utterly shattered. She leaned forward in the witness chair, her face contorted with absolute, unadulterated fury. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Tom. I never said any of those things, she screamed loudly. Prove it. Tom silently reached into his briefcase and calmly pulled out the digitized audio file. Tom held a small black digital recorder in his right hand, lifting it high enough for everyone in the courtroom to see the tiny device. The metallic glint caught the harsh fluorescent lights of the ceiling. Bradley Peterson practically threw himself across the plaintiff table, his face flushing a bright, dangerous shade of crimson. He shouted a string of rapid objections citing hearsay, lack of foundation, and unverified digital manipulation. He knew his entire multi-million-dollar corporate scheme was resting on a fragile house of cards, and Tom was holding the match. Judge Harrison banged his wooden gavel, demanding order, as the gallery erupted into a frenzy of hushed, excited whispers. The judge glared down at Tom, his silver hair catching the light. "Counselor," the judge warned, his voice thick with authoritative menace. "You better explain exactly what that is, and you better have a spectacular legal justification for introducing unvetted audio evidence into my courtroom at the absolute last minute." Tom did not flinch under the heavy judicial pressure. "Your Honor," Tom replied smoothly, his voice echoing across the silent room. "This is a direct, unedited digital transfer of a microcassette tape. It was recovered early this morning from the defendant's attic. It contains a voicemail message left on a home answering machine 15 years ago on the exact night the plaintiff abandoned her children. The voice on this recording belongs entirely to the woman sitting on the witness stand right now. It directly contradicts her sworn testimony, and it absolutely proves she just committed deliberate perjury in your courtroom." Judge Harrison looked at Bradley Peterson, who was currently sweating profusely, and then looked back at Tom. The judge had a choice to make. He was on the corporate payroll, but the courtroom was completely packed with local journalists. If he suppressed a piece of direct exculpatory evidence in front of the press, his judicial career would be over before the sun went down. He had to let it play. The judge let out a heavy, frustrated sigh, leaning back in his tall leather chair. "I will allow it," the judge muttered coldly. "Proceed." Tom walked slowly toward the center of the room. He held the digital recorder near the small microphone mounted on the wooden podium, ensuring the audio would be broadcast loudly through the courtroom speakers. Monica was gripping the wooden railing of the witness box so tightly her knuckles were completely white. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. She stared at the black device with eyes full of absolute, undeniable terror. Tom pressed the play button. A sharp, grating burst of static hissed through the overhead speakers, followed by the heavy rhythmic sound of pouring rain and a revving car engine. Then the voice cut through the ambient noise. It was crystal clear, sharp, and dripping with a cold, terrifying impatience. It was Monica. "Dad, pick up the phone. I know you are there. Pick it up." A collective gasp rippled through the huge courtroom gallery. Monica squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear of genuine fear rolling down her pale cheek. The recording continued, filling the massive room with the undeniable truth of her cruelty. "Listen to me, Dad. I do not have time to argue with you, so I am just going to leave this message. I left the kids on your front porch. Do not bother looking for me. I am gone. I am taking the $50,000 life insurance check from my deadbeat ex-husband. That money belongs to me. It is mine. Those kids are nothing but a massive anchor dragging me down, and I am finally cutting the rope. I do not care what you do with them. Keep them. Throw them in a state orphanage. Give them to the foster system. It makes absolutely no difference to me." I left the official abandonment papers in the front pocket of the blue backpack. I signed them and had them perfectly notarized this morning. You have full legal custody now. Do not ever try to call this number again. I am starting my real life today. Goodbye, old man. The audio ended with a sharp, loud, final mechanical click. Tom reached out and pressed the stop button on the digital recorder. The silence that followed was not just quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. The absolute destruction of Monica's 15-year lie was complete and total. The carefully constructed narrative of a tragically depressed mother wandering blindly into a freezing storm to seek medical help had been entirely vaporized by her own venomous words. She had not been locked in a psychiatric ward against her will. She had not spent a single day looking for her lost children. She had willingly, selfishly discarded them for $50,000 and a fresh start in a different state. I looked at Monica. The arrogant, condescending woman from the mediation room was completely gone. The weeping, tragic victim she played just 10 minutes ago had entirely vanished. She sat slumped in the heavy wooden witness chair, her face completely drained of all color, her jaw hanging slightly open in pure, unadulterated shock. She could not speak. She could not breathe. She was completely exposed in front of the entire world. I looked over at Bradley Peterson. The slick, confident corporate shark was slowly backing away from the plaintiff table. He was putting physical distance between himself and his client. He knew that representing a client who had just committed a massive felony in open court could cost him his lucrative law license. I turned slightly in my chair and looked back at my 3 grandchildren. They were entirely free. Up on the elevated bench, Judge Harrison looked like he had just been physically struck. His face was extremely pale and shocked. The fabricated corporate scheme had blown up spectacularly. He stared down at me. Did she really say those words? I stood up very slowly. Every word, not a single one missing. The absolute finality of my statement hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the entire courtroom exploded into absolute chaos. Reporters in the back rows were frantically typing on their phones, whispering loudly to one another as the magnitude of the scandal broke wide open. The gallery was in an uproar. Up on the bench, Judge Harrison was furiously banging his heavy wooden gavel, his face flushed with a mixture of profound embarrassment and terrifying anger. "Order," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure of the room. "I will have order in this court right now." But Monica was not listening to the judge. She was violently trembling, her eyes darting wildly around the room like a trapped animal looking for a desperate escape route. She suddenly stood up from the witness chair, her chair scraping harshly against the polished floor, and took a frantic step toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. She was actually going to run. Before she could even make it past the plaintiff table, 2 massive armed bailiffs immediately stepped out from the shadows of the wall, moving swiftly to block the main aisle. Their hands rested firmly on their utility belts, a silent, deeply intimidating warning. Monica froze in her tracks, breathing heavily, entirely, surrounded by the hostile reality of her own making. She spun around, looking desperately at Bradley Peterson. "Bradley, do something," she pleaded, her voice a high-pitched, terrifying shriek. "Tell them it is a fake tape. Tell them to let me leave right now." But Bradley Peterson was already packing his expensive leather briefcase with a frantic, uncharacteristic sloppiness. He did not look at her. He did not offer a single word of comfort. Instead, the slick corporate lawyer turned his back on the woman he had meticulously coached to lie facing the furious judge directly. "Your Honor," Bradley said, his voice completely devoid of its previous arrogant warmth. "In light of this entirely unexpected and highly disturbing new evidence, I must formally request an immediate withdrawal as counsel for the plaintiff. I was deliberately misled by my client regarding the fundamental facts of this case. I cannot in good conscience continue this representation." Monica gasped, taking a step toward him. "You cannot do this to me," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at his chest. "You told me exactly what to say. You knew about the Vegas debt. You set up the property deal with your company." Bradley flinched, his eyes wide with sudden panic as she began to expose the deep corporate corruption in front of the press. He raised his hands defensively. "My client is clearly experiencing a severe mental break." He stammered nervously to the judge. "I have no knowledge of any such illegal arrangements. I am removing myself from this courtroom immediately." He grabbed his briefcase and practically sprinted down the side aisle, abandoning her entirely to save his own lucrative career. Judge Harrison watched the lawyer flee, his expression darkening into a dangerous scowl. He knew the local journalists were recording every single word. He knew his secret alliance with Apex Development was dangerously close to being exposed by a desperate, panicking woman. He had to shut her down immediately to protect himself. He pointed his heavy wooden gavel directly at Monica. "Sit down, Miss Gallagher," the judge roared, his voice echoing like thunder across the silent room. "You are not going anywhere. You have made a complete mockery of this judicial system. You have committed blatant, undeniable perjury in my courtroom." Tom stepped forward, breaking the heavy tension. "Your Honor," Tom said calmly, "if the court requires further authentication of the audio recording, the defense is prepared to submit the accompanying physical evidence." Tom nodded to me, so I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a folded, slightly yellowed piece of thick paper. I walked slowly up to the wooden railing and handed it directly to the court clerk, who passed it up to the bench. "That is the original physical abandonment document she mentioned on the tape," I explained, my voice steady and unwavering. "It has her authentic signature, perfectly dated from 15 years ago, and it carries the official red seal of a licensed state notary. I kept it hidden at the bottom of a locked toolbox for a decade and a half. It completely proves that she surrendered all legal parental rights willingly, intentionally, and legally before she walked away to collect her insurance money." Judge Harrison examined the document carefully. He ran his thumb over the raised red notary seal. He looked down at Monica, who had collapsed back into the plaintiff chair, her face buried in her hands, weeping with a pathetic, broken despair. The judge shook his head slowly, a look of performative disgust settling perfectly onto his face. He looked out at the gallery, making sure the reporters were hanging on his every word. "In my 20 years on the bench, I have never witnessed such a vile, calculated attempt to defraud this court and manipulate the sacred bonds of family," Judge Harrison declared loudly. "The custody petition is denied with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, I am officially invalidating the forged power of attorney and ordering an immediate injunction against any real estate transactions involving the Gallagher property." He paused, turning his cold eyes back to the weeping woman. "Bailiffs, take the plaintiff into immediate custody. She is being held on preliminary charges of felony perjury and gross financial fraud." The two heavy bailiffs moved forward simultaneously. They grabbed Monica by the arms, pulling her roughly out of the wooden chair. She screamed, struggling helplessly against their iron grip. As they pulled her arms behind her back, the sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly through the completely silent courtroom. The sound was incredibly final. The polished, arrogant woman who had worn designer shoes to a mediation hearing was now completely reduced to a sobbing, terrified criminal. As the bailiffs began to drag her down the center aisle toward the holding cell doors, they passed directly by the front row of the gallery. Monica dug her expensive heels into the floor, desperately fighting to stop moving. She looked right at the 3 children she had discarded so easily. "Tyler, Maya, Leo," she begged, her voice cracking with sheer agonizing desperation. "Please, you have to help me. Tell them I am your mother. Please do not let them take me away. I am your mother." Tyler slowly stood up from the wooden bench. He was much taller than her now, a strong, educated young man, built by years of sacrifice and hard work. He looked down at this weeping, handcuffed woman with eyes as cold and completely indifferent as a winter storm. He did not show an ounce of pity. "I do not know you," Tyler said. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut, cutting off the sound of Monica weeping as the bailiffs dragged her down the marble corridor toward the holding cells. The silence that followed her departure was absolute and profound. Tyler did not look back. Maya and Leo stood right beside him, their shoulders relaxed for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. We walked out of that courthouse not as victims of a massive corporate conspiracy, but as a family that had walked through the fire and emerged entirely unbroken. The fallout from the trial was swift and absolutely merciless. The local press seized the story of the corrupt judge and the corporate bribery scheme. Within 48 hours, Apex Development was under a federal investigation. Bradley Peterson was facing immediate disbarment and criminal charges for facilitating fraud. The commercial highway project was halted, leaving Apex bleeding money and fighting off furious investors. Their entire empire began to crumble, built on the fragile foundation of my daughter and her terrible lies. But I did not care about their downfall. I only cared about rebuilding what they had tried to destroy. The following week, I sat in a very different kind of boardroom. I did not wear a tailored suit, and I did not pretend to be a polished corporate negotiator. I wore my faded denim work jacket sitting across a sleek glass table from the chief executive officer of Vanguard Properties, the largest and most aggressive rival competitor to Apex Development. They knew exactly how valuable my land was, and they knew Apex had lost their exclusive grip on the zoning district. I laid the clean, unencumbered property deed on the table. I did not ask for their initial offer. I simply stated my price. $5 million, I told them, my voice calm and completely unyielding. Not a single penny less, and the transaction must be entirely finalized by Friday. The executives looked at each other, realizing they had a golden opportunity to permanently crush their biggest rival by taking control of the main highway access road. They signed the agreement without a single moment of hesitation. $5 million was wired directly into my secure bank account exactly 3 days later. The heavy, suffocating weight of poverty that had crushed my shoulders for 15 years vanished in an absolute instant. The very first thing I did was drive to the university. I walked directly into the financial aid office and paid off the entire tuition balance for Maya and the architectural engineering program for Tyler in full. I ensured they would never have to lose sleep over a bank statement or a frozen account ever again. 6 months later, we found ourselves walking back into the exact same county courthouse. But this time, we were not there to fight a terrifying legal battle against a monster. We were there to finally seal the cracks in our foundation. We stood in a small, warmly lit chambers room before a different judge, a kind woman who smiled genuinely as we approached her bench. Tom O'Connor stood proudly by my side, holding a thin stack of very important legal documents. In our state, there is a beautiful legal provision known as adult adoption. It allows grown children to legally sever all ties with their biological parents and choose the person who actually raised them. Tyler, Maya, and Leo took turns stepping up to the judge and her desk. They each picked up a black pen and signed their names on the dotted lines. With those simple strokes of ink, Monica Gallagher was erased from their birth certificates. She was no longer their mother in the eyes of the law, just as she had never been their mother in the reality of their daily lives. When the judge stamped the papers with her official seal, declaring me their sole legal father, Maya threw her arms around my neck and cried. But these were not tears of pain. They were tears of absolute, overwhelming joy. Tyler shook my hand firmly, pulling me into a tight embrace while Leo simply rested his head against my shoulder. We walked out of the courthouse and stepped into the bright, warm afternoon sunlight, leaving the dark ghosts of our past behind us forever. We never returned to the old rusting auto repair shop. I used a portion of the $5 million to purchase a massive state-of-the-art commercial garage on the affluent north side of the city. It has 6 pristine hydraulic lifts, a fully stocked digital tool room, and a bright, comfortable waiting area. It is no longer my business. It is a true family enterprise. On a quiet Tuesday evening, after the last customer had driven away, I stood near the back bay doors. The setting sun spilled across the clean, polished concrete floor. Leo was working under the hood of a classic muscle car, whistling a cheerful tune as he adjusted the timing belt. He is going to run this place one day, and I know he will do it with the same stubborn integrity I tried to teach him. Maya is finishing clinical rotations, and Tyler landed a junior architect position downtown. They are safe. They are thriving. They are free from the toxic poison that tried to ruin them. I leaned against my metal workbench, holding a simple shop rag. I looked down at my hands. They are old, scarred, and deeply lined with age. The dark black grease is permanently settled into the deep creases of my skin, a lifelong tattoo of hard labor and endless sacrifice. I wiped my fingers slowly, a quiet, peaceful smile spreading across my face as I watched Leo lower the hood of the car. We survived the absolute worst of human greed, and we built something beautiful from the ashes. Blood makes you related. But loyalty, sacrifice, and the grease under your fingernails, that's what makes you a father.